The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the doors swung open. In walked Olivia Carter, a young woman draped in designer fashion, her golden hair cascading in perfect waves. She barely glanced at the rows of people watching her, her attention fixed on her phone screen as she scrolled through her social media feed. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't even paying attention. To her, this was nothing more than an inconvenience, a temporary detour in her otherwise glamorous life. At the front of the room, Judge Marcus Reynolds sat behind the towering wooden bench, his deep-set eyes studying the young woman with a measured calm. He had seen all types in his courtroom: hardened criminals, desperate souls, people who made mistakes and truly regretted them. But Olivia, she didn't fit any of those categories. The way she carried herself, the way she smirked at her screen, the way she barely acknowledged the seriousness of the situation. It was clear she thought she was untouchable. As she took her seat, Olivia finally looked up, her blue eyes flicking to the judge. She let out a small, amused chuckle before casually holding up her phone and snapping a selfie. The camera's click echoed through the courtroom, sending a ripple of shocked gasps through the audience. Judge Reynolds narrowed his eyes. He had dealt with arrogance before, but this was something else. "Put the phone down, young lady." His voice cut through the room with quiet authority. Olivia sighed dramatically, placing her phone on her lap, but the smirk never left her face. She leaned back in her chair, completely unfazed, as if she were simply waiting for this to be over. After all, she had never faced real consequences before. In her world, problems disappeared with a phone call or a swipe of a credit card. But today was different. Today, she was facing a judge who had no patience for entitlement. And the sentence he was about to deliver, it would leave everyone in that courtroom speechless. Judge Reynolds adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable as he glanced down at the case file in front of him. The charges against Olivia weren't minor: reckless driving, destruction of property, and resisting arrest. But from the way she sat there, twirling a strand of hair around her finger, it was obvious she thought none of it really mattered. Her lawyer, an older man in a stiff suit, cleared his throat and rose to speak. "Your Honor, my client deeply regrets." Yeah, Olivia interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. "Regret, remorse, all that." She rolled her eyes. "Can we just move this along? I have a flight to catch." The room went silent. A few jurors exchanged glances. Even her own lawyer looked stunned. Judge Reynolds, however, remained still, his fingers interlocked as he studied her. "Young lady," he said slowly, his voice firm but calm, "do you understand where you are right now?" She let out a soft laugh, tilting her head. Yeah, a courtroom. But honestly, it feels more like a waste of time." A murmur ran through the audience. A few reporters in the back scribbled furiously in their notepads, sensing a story worth capturing. Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze never leaving Olivia. "Tell me," he continued, "what exactly do you think should happen today?" Olivia shrugged. Isn't this where you give me some community service or a fine? Maybe a little probation. Then I walk out of here, and we all move on with our lives." She smiled, crossing her arms. "I assume we can wrap this up before lunch." A woman in the front row let out a small gasp. A man in the jury shook his head. Olivia, however, remained blissfully unaware, still convinced that this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But Judge Reynolds wasn't amused. He closed the file in front of him, his expression darkening. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice dropping to a level that sent a chill through the room, "I don't think you fully grasp what's happening here. But you will. Very soon." Olivia's smirk faltered just slightly. Something about the judge's tone sent an unfamiliar feeling creeping up her spine. something she couldn't quite place. Was it uncertainty? No, that wasn't possible. She had never been in a situation she couldn't talk or pay her way out of. Still, for the first time since walking in, she felt the weight of the room pressing in around her. Judge Reynolds took a long pause, letting the silence stretch, watching her closely. He had dealt with arrogance before, but Olivia wasn't just arrogant. She was disconnected, floating through life without ever facing consequences. He had seen where that kind of mindset led, and he wasn't about to let her walk out of here without understanding the gravity of her actions. "Miss Carter, let's talk about the night of your arrest," he finally said, his deep voice steady. "You were driving over 90 miles per hour in a residential area. You crashed into a public park, damaging city property. When the officers arrived, you refused to comply and attempted to leave the scene." Olivia shifted in her seat, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. "I wasn't trying to leave. I was just frustrated. It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what exactly was misunderstood? The speed limit? The property damage? Or was it the fact that you told the arresting officer, and I quote, 'Do you even know who my father is?'" A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom, but Judge Reynolds didn't smile. Olivia huffed, crossing her arms. "People say things when they're upset." "Ah," he nodded, as if considering her words. "And were you upset when you refused a breathalyzer test?" She opened her mouth, then hesitated. That part wasn't as easy to dismiss. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. A woman in the jury shook her head in disapproval. Judge Reynolds glanced down at the file again before speaking. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what do you think would have happened if, instead of a park bench, you had hit a pedestrian that night?" Olivia felt her throat tighten, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. "But I didn't." The judge exhaled, his patience unwavering. "And that's exactly why you're here." Olivia swallowed, but quickly covered it with another shrug. "Look, I get it. Bad things could have happened. But they didn't. So why are we still dragging this out?" Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the wooden bench. His expression remained unreadable, but the intensity in his eyes hadn't wavered. "Miss Carter, I want you to listen carefully," he said, his voice lower now, calmer, but somehow even more powerful. "You keep acting as if this is all theoretical, as if the damage you've done is just an inconvenience. But I don't deal in hypotheticals, I deal in reality. And the reality is, your reckless choices have consequences, whether you want to face them or not." The air in the courtroom felt heavier. Olivia could sense it, the shift. The way people were looking at her. The way they were waiting, holding their breath. It was the first time in her life that she wasn't in control of the narrative. Her father had always told her that money could fix anything. That no matter what she did, there would always be a way out. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. The judge turned his attention to a woman sitting in the front row, a woman Olivia hadn't paid much attention to before. She was middle-aged, dressed in dark, modest clothing, her hands tightly clasped together in her lap. "Mrs. Delgado," the judge said, "would you mind standing for a moment?" The woman rose slowly, her eyes meeting Olivia's for the first time. There was no anger in them, no accusation, just a quiet, deep sadness that made Olivia shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Miss Carter," the judge continued, "this is Maria Delgado. Her son, Eric, was playing in that park the night of your crash. He was sitting on that same bench you destroyed. By some miracle, he got up just moments before your car came barreling through." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. She didn't blink. "Tell me again, Judge Reynolds said, his voice now razor-sharp, how this was just a misunderstanding. Olivia's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She glanced around the courtroom, expecting someone, her lawyer, maybe even her father, to jump in and make this moment disappear. But no one did. The weight of Mrs. Delgado's presence, of her son's near tragedy, hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. For the first time since this all began, Olivia felt something foreign creeping in. Guilt. It was uncomfortable, suffocating. But she refused to let it show. Instead, she forced a breath, straightened her shoulders, and muttered, "Well, but he wasn't hurt." The gasps in the room were louder this time. Mrs. Delgado flinched, as if the words themselves had struck her. Her hands trembled at her sides, and Olivia, for a split second, regretted saying it. But she didn't know how else to react. She had spent her whole life brushing off problems, turning them into inconveniences. Why was this any different? Judge Reynolds exhaled sharply, his expression darkening. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low but sharp, "the fact that Eric Delgado wasn't hurt is not a testament to your innocence. It's a testament to pure luck. And luck," he leaned forward slightly, "has a way of running out." The room was dead silent. Olivia felt a sudden, unfamiliar panic clawing at her chest. But before she could respond, the courtroom doors creaked open. Everyone turned. A tall man in a crisp suit strode inside, his face set in stone. Olivia's breath hitched. She knew that walk, that look. Her father, Charles Carter, wasn't a man who begged. He didn't plead. He controlled, he fixed. And as he made his way to the front of the courtroom, Olivia let out a slow breath, knowing, believing that this was it. He'd make this go away. But then something happened that she never expected. Instead of speaking to the judge, her father barely glanced at her before walking straight to the prosecution's table. His voice was low, firm, but unmistakable. "I need to speak to you about a deal." Olivia's stomach dropped. A deal? This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Olivia's hands clenched into fists as she watched her father whisper to the prosecution. This wasn't right. He was supposed to storm in, demand the judge dismiss everything, and walk her out like he always did. But this, deal asterisk. That word sent a shiver down her spine. She could see Judge Reynolds watching carefully, his expression unreadable. The courtroom murmured, curious about what was unfolding. Olivia sat frozen, her pulse racing. This wasn't how things worked in her world. Her father never negotiated. He never admitted fault. After what felt like an eternity, Charles Carter finally turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual, "my daughter is ready to take responsibility for her actions." Olivia's stomach dropped. What? Asterisk. She shot up from her seat. "Dad, what are you doing?" she hissed, her voice sharp with panic. For the first time in her life, her father's gaze didn't reassure her. It was cold, distant, and filled with something she never expected, disappointment. "Sit down, Olivia." She hesitated, but the weight in his voice made her collapse back into her chair. Her heart pounded in her ears. Judge Reynolds studied them both, then nodded. "Go on." Charles adjusted his tie, choosing his words carefully. "We've discussed a plea agreement. Olivia will plead guilty. No special treatment. She will accept full accountability for what she's done." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to protest, but her father's sharp glance silenced her. "And what does accountability look like in your mind, Mr. Carter?" Judge Reynolds asked, his tone steady. Charles inhaled deeply. 1 year of community service. No shortcuts, no loopholes. And she will work under Mrs. Delgado's supervision. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Olivia felt like the ground beneath her had disappeared. Asterisk work for Mrs. Delgado asterisk, the woman whose son she nearly hurt. The woman who had every reason to hate her. She turned to her father, desperation in her eyes. "Dad, please." But he wasn't listening. Judge Reynolds looked at Mrs. Delgado. "Are you willing to oversee this, ma'am?" The woman took a moment before nodding. "Yes, but she won't get an easy time." The judge turned back to Olivia. Then it settled. He tapped his gavel. "Miss Carter, welcome to your new reality." Olivia sat there, stunned. For the first time in her life, there was no easy way out. Olivia sat frozen, the weight of the sentence settling over her like a heavy fog. Her father didn't look at her again. He simply gave the judge a respectful nod, then turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving her behind. It was the first time he wasn't there to clean up her mess. The bailiff motioned for her to stand. Her legs felt weak, but she obeyed, her mind spinning. Community service. Working for asterisk Mrs. Delgado asterisk. This wasn't some weekend charity event where she could show up, take a few pictures, and leave. This was real. As she stepped out of the courtroom, she caught sight of Mrs. Delgado standing in the hallway. Olivia hesitated, expecting a glare, maybe even some angry words. But Mrs. Delgado just studied her for a moment before speaking. "You don't know anything about the people you hurt, do you?" Olivia's throat tightened. She wanted to snap back, to defend herself, but the truth was she didn't have an answer. She didn't know. She had never wanted asterisk to know. The first day of her community service was the hardest. Mrs. Delgado assigned her to work at a local youth center, where kids like Eric spent their afternoons. Olivia kept her head down, feeling completely out of place. No designer clothes, no expensive makeup, just a plain t-shirt and work she had never done before. Days turned into weeks. Olivia cleaned, organized, and even sat with the kids during activities. She learned their names, their stories. She saw how much they looked up to Mrs. Delgado, how much this place meant to them. And slowly, something shifted. One afternoon, Eric walked up to her, holding a basketball. "You want to play?" he asked. Olivia hesitated, then nodded. As she dribbled clumsily, laughter bubbled up from the kids around her. For the first time, it wasn't at her expense. It was shared. Mrs. Delgado watched from a distance, a knowing look in her eyes. Olivia wasn't the same girl who had walked into that courtroom. And maybe, just maybe, she never would be again.